Hi, I'm Dan and welcome to Polar Currency and video number 44. This video is unique for me because the idea and inspiration came from a viewer who left a comment on my Top 10 Twos video mentioning the obsolete banknotes from Singapore, Michigan. All he said in the one comment was, "A town that disappeared under sand dunes." I mean, a town that disappears under sand dunes in Michigan that issued currency. I immediately fired up the Google machine, started reading, sat back and said to myself, this is why I collect paper currency. This is a great story with fantastic banknotes that provide some insight into how local banks began issuing their own currency. But you know me, we've got to start with a little background.
Since the colonization of what is now the United States, there's always been a shortage of coin or hard money. The second that Europeans set foot in British North America, there wasn't enough gold and silver coinage, and that would continue through to the 1870s. So when there was a shortage of coin, which was basically all the time, paper currency stepped in and served a purpose. In the pre-industrial revolution era, from 1800 to 1850, with the population and the economy growing at a rapid rate, the lack of circulating currency became acute. The capacity of the U.S. Mint was also greatly limited in how much it could produce. Whether you liked it or not, paper currency served a need in commerce, an ever-growing need that coinage simply could not meet. Certainly and rightfully, the framers of the U.S. Constitution were very leery of paper currency because of the failure of the Continental dollar. Continental currency is considered the first federally issued paper money. These notes provided the financing that made the American Revolution possible, and they were only backed by a promise and the faith of a new country. These banknotes are considered a failure, but without them, the history of the U.S. would be very different. Our country owes a lot to a simple fiat currency that gave us the expression, "not worth a continental." Since the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, there's been a debate as to if the federal government can issue paper currency. What is clear that the Constitution does prohibit states from issuing coinage, but it doesn't specifically prohibit states from chartering banks to issue paper currency. State-chartered banks began springing up across the country in the early 1800s, each issuing their own banknotes. In theory, these notes were redeemable at the issuing bank for the equivalent in gold or silver coin. But in actuality, the farther away you got from that bank, the more discounted the banknote became.
At one point, prior to the U.S. Civil War, it's estimated that there were over 30,000 institutions that issued paper currency. However, the reliability of the banks varied greatly. And if the bank went under, so did your banknote. Many banks went out of business as a result of three major panics in the first half of the 1800s, which greatly diminished people's trust in paper currency. Panic was the term used then. Today, we call it a recession.
Obsolete banknotes were printed by private engraving companies, and there were a lot of them, the American Banknote Company being the most prominent. Most obsolete banknotes were issued from the late 1700s until the 1870s. Again, they enabled our economy to grow and prosper when the U.S. Mint could not keep up with demand. If everything was going to be backed by 100% gold or silver, the United States would have never grown as fast as it did. The beginning of the end of obsolete banknotes was the National Currency Act of 1863, which created a currency for banks that would be federally chartered, regulated, and issued by the U.S.Treasury. The result was the creation of national banknotes, which was a federally backed option to compete against privately issued banknotes. The final nail in the coffin for obsolete notes issued by private banks came with the Internal Revenue Act of 1865, that imposed a 10% tax on any banknotes not issued by the federal government. There was no longer enough profit for these financial institutions to issue paper money. And that brings us back to Michigan. Specifically the western shore of Lake Michigan, about 35 miles southwest of Grand Rapids, and the city of Saugatuck, or rather the area that was known as the Village of Singapore at the mouth of the Kalamazoo River in Allegan County. In 1836, O'Shea Wilder and 4 other men agreed to purchase land as an investment at the Singapore site, where Wilder noted that it would be well suited for the building of a sawmill. Wilder, from Massachusetts, had visited the area earlier in 1831. By 1837, Wilder and his group had a contract to build the mill along with a boatyard and housing for workmen. He was so confident that he moved his entire family to Michigan. Yet at the same time, Wilder noted that hard money was rather scarce, but real estate continued to be developed. Wilder was in luck. In 1837, the newly formed state of Michigan passed a general banking law that permitted any 10 or more freeholders to organize themselves into a corporation for the transaction of banking business, with a capital of not less than $50,000, no more than $300,000. These banks were empowered to print and issue their own paper money. The act further provided that banks had to have 30% of the stock be paid in specie or hard money, defined in the act as gold coins, but usually gold in any form and silver coins were considered acceptable.
When the banking law was passed, Wilder was quick to act on behalf of the village of Singapore and organized the Bank of Singapore, with the application dated October 5, 1837, with the Allegan County. The bank began operations with a capital stock of $50,000 or almost $2 million today. Daniel S. Wilder, the son of O'Shea, was named president of the bank, and Rob Hill was to serve as cashier, and they both did sign the banknotes. The bank was located first in a boarding house and then moved to a separate building. Records around the time show pressed brick was ordered and shipped in from Boston for the construction of a vault.
I purchased this $1 Obsolete at the Whitman Expo in Baltimore earlier this year. It's a remainder, meaning it was never issued into circulation. On the left is the Roman god Mercury presenting a cornucopia of coins to Moneta, the Roman goddess of money and minting of money, not a member of the boy band group Menudo, although it sounds like it. She has a bald eagle behind her with a ribbon in its beak, partially reading Mercus Tutus. That's Latin, meaning wages protected. The center vignette is a river steamboat heading east, then the center bank and denomination block, and at the bottom is the pledge that real estate and private holdings back the bank. The far right vignette is a statue of George Washington, basically in a Roman toga. That's not something you see every day, or really want to. According to Harold L. Bowen's 1956 book, State Banknotes of Michigan, the Singapore banknotes were printed by Rawdon, Wright & Hatch, a New York engraving firm, in $1, $2, $3, and $5 denominations on a printed sheet for a total of $11 per sheet. There were 5,000 sheets printed for a total face value of $55,000. The bills, printed on one side only, were struck on a single sheet and then cut apart and signed by the cashier and president prior to being placed into circulation. Of the $55,000, records show that banknotes valued at only $15,952 were actually put into circulation during the bank's short existence. On the left side of the $2 bill is the Roman goddess of Justia and Libertas, justice and liberty, with a bald eagle perched on a shield displaying a sunrise, which is a symbol of rebirth and life, with the Latin word excelsior inscribed at the bottom, meaning higher ever upward. The center vignette depicts harbor docks with sailing ships and a sidewheel steamer. Below is the bank and denomination block, and then the pledge at the bottom. The right vignette is of a train on a stone arch bridge appearing to leave an industrial area.
The creation of the bank and the area prospering from lumber and shipbuilding in the 1840s saw a boom for Singapore. At its height, the town boasted 3 mills, 2 hotels, several general stores, of course the bank, and even a schoolhouse totaling about 24 buildings. An official census was never kept for Singapore, but historical accounts say approximately 200 people live there. Schooners and barges were being built and lumber was being sold out of Singapore. The area became a center of commerce for that part of Michigan for the next 20 years. It was thought at the time that Singapore could rival Milwaukee and Chicago as a primary shipping and lumber port on the Great Lakes. But talk is big, and the area most likely was not going to boom. And Wilder knew it, selling out his investment in 1846, which was also sold twice again before 1850. But the village did prosper, and the boatworks built the first 3-masted schooner on Lake Michigan, named the Octavia, to carry lumber from Singapore to Chicago for, again, the next 20 years.
I purchased the $3 note from the same person who recommended the Singapore video idea to me. You never know where notes are going to come from. We emailed back and forth, and he offered a few Singapore notes, so I purchased the 3. The left depicts a 3-masted schooner. Makes sense because Singapore built schooners. The center vignette depicts Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture and fertility, and the right depicts Justia again, the Roman goddess of justice, standing with another sunrise shield and a bald eagle in front of the cargo on a dock. What's really cool? Look at the date. The note was issued on December 25, 1837, and is signed by the previously mentioned cashier Rob Hill and bank president Daniel Wilder. I guess banks were open on holidays back then. But growth came at a price. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire broke out and would need lots of lumber to rebuild, and fast. The Singapore area had some of the last good timber that existed in a forest ring that was between the village and Lake Michigan. Singapore was protected by those woods, but it was all clear-cut and shipped to Chicago to help them rebuild. This was true for most of the Kalamazoo River Valley. Without the trees, the area was open to prevailing Lake Michigan western winds. Along with the winds came lots of sand, and more sand. The result was catastrophic, and Singapore would succumb to environmental suicide. Over the course of the next several years and decade, the sand kept coming. The residents of Singapore couldn't keep up with the removal and eventually had to relocate. A handful of buildings were dismantled and moved, but most remained buried under the sand. The village of Singapore became a buried ghost town. Locals say some structures can still be seen today if you know where to look. A few other buildings were moved to Saugatuck, but for the most part, Singapore was gone. The last Singapore banknote is the 5. The center vignette illustrates another river steamboat, only heading west this time. The far right again depicts the Roman god of Mercury presenting a cornucopia of coins to Eunomenida, the Roman goddess of money, minting, and all that stuff. But this time, she's got a griffin by her side. In Greek and Roman texts, griffins were associated with gold deposits of Central Asia. One of the buildings moved was the Singapore Bank. It was slid down the frozen Kalamazoo River and relocated to Butler Street in Saugatuck, which is the waterfront district that serves as its main street. It's a bookstore and art gallery today, but Google Maps shows that it's going out of business. But way before the town got buried under the sand, the bank had a few big problems. The Bank of Singapore was known as a wildcat bank, which is a term applied to banks with at best bad reputations and at worst full-blown criminal activity. The term wildcat banking supposedly had its genesis in the 1830s in Michigan, where bankers were believed to have set up banks in areas so remote that wildcats roamed there. In other words, areas like Singapore.
The Bank of Singapore was forced to close down due to disreputable practices. One of those practices was to share hard specie, gold and silver, with the Bank of Allegan. Michigan's banking law required that banks were inspected every 3 months and had to produce hard specie to account for 30% of the amount of paper notes that had been issued. As the story goes, the Singapore and Allegan Bank, being geographically close by, especially by road, and closer by river, shared their gold and silver. The inspector would show up at one bank, complete the inspection, and travel by horse to the next. When he left, the gold and silver would be packed up and moved by boat to the next bank, beating the inspector. Of course, there was forewarning the inspector was coming in the first place. That was the scam, and it ran out when the Michigan Bank Commissioner suspended operations in 1839. In 1842, the bank charter was formally annulled by the state.
Very few things that remain today will let you know that the village of Singapore ever existed. One is the historical marker located on Butler Street in Saugatuck, erected in 1958 by the Michigan Historical Commission. The name still carries on at the Singapore Yacht Club, located on the Kalamazoo River in Saugatuck. And finally, there are the banknotes that I'm sure are scattered far and wide throughout the country. In one way or another, they all tell a ghost story about a town buried under the sand. Now that's something that you just don't hear every day.
That's it for video number 44, Buried Banknotes. I want to say thanks to the Night Phantom 3433 for giving me the idea and selling me the Bank of Singapore $3 note. I also want to give credit to the book Buried Singapore, Michigan's Imaginary Pompeii by Kit Lane and the National Museum of the Great Lakes. The Bank of Singapore notes and the story behind them is exactly why I make these videos, especially when they're from a time period in U.S. history that not a lot of people pay attention to. I hope you enjoyed the video and I appreciate your time. If you like what you see, please hit the thumbs up button, feel free to leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and thanks for checking in.